Chapter 2. The sun was high and hot, hanging in the sky like a bleached white eye. It was noon. Elias stood on the porch, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. The fear from the morning had burned off along with the dew on the grass. Now, standing in the bright daylight, he just felt angry. He felt stupid. 27 rows, he muttered, spitting onto the dry ground. My ass. He had spent the last hour trying to start his grandfather's old chainsaw. It was a heavy, rusted beast of a machine he'd found in the shed, smelling of varnish and ancient gasoline. Elias had stripped the carburetor, cleaned the plug, and fed it a fresh mix of fuel from his own supply. He yanked the starter cord. The engine sputtered, coughed a cloud of blue smoke, and died. "Come on, you piece of junk," Elias growled. He yanked it again. This time, the engine caught. It roared to life with a sound like tearing metal, vibrating so hard it made Elias's teeth ache. It was a good, loud, mechanical noise. It sounded like the city. It sounded like control. Elias revved the engine twice, watching the chain spin, a blur of sharp steel teeth. "Problem solved," he said. He wasn't going to play games with a diary written by a crazy old man. He wasn't going to measure distances every morning and wet his pants over a bundle of straw. He was a contractor. If a wall was in the way, you knocked it down. If a pipe leaked, you patched it. If a scarecrow moved, you cut it into firewood. Elias stepped off the porch and marched toward the south field. The walk felt longer than it looked. The ground in the yard was overgrown with weeds that snatched at his work boots. But as soon as he crossed the invisible line into the south field, the ground changed. It became hard-packed gray dirt. No weeds, no grass, just those perfect, deep furrows that looked like ripples in a frozen pond. He walked down the center aisle, counting his steps out of habit. The air grew still. The roar of the chainsaw seemed to get swallowed up by the open space, sounding thinner, weaker. The closer he got, the worse the smell became. It wasn't just rot. It smelled like a wet dog that had been rolling in sulfur. It made the back of Elias's throat itch. He stopped 10 feet away from the thing. Up close, the scarecrow was hideous. It was taller than Elias, maybe 6'5" if it were standing on the ground, but it was mounted on a thick wooden pole that disappeared into the scarecrow's back. The tuxedo jacket was stiff with mold, the fabric green and black. The buttons were made of bone, small yellowed vertebrae from some small animal. But it was the head that bothered him the most. It was a burlap sack, sure, but it was stuffed so tight it looked hard, like a rock wrapped in cloth. The rope around the neck was buried deep, cinched tight enough to choke. There were no eyes drawn on the face, but where the eyes should be, the burlap was stained darker, as if something wet had seeped through from the inside. "All right, ugly," Elias yelled over the idle rumble of the saw. "Eviction time." The scarecrow didn't move. It just hung there, limp and heavy. The arms, empty sleeves fluttering slightly, were currently pointing toward the woods, away from the house. Elias stepped up to the base of the pole. The wood of the pole was weird. It wasn't treated lumber. It looked like a branch from a tree that didn't grow in this part of the country, dark, twisted, and smooth as polished stone. Elias planted his feet. He gripped the chainsaw handle tight. "Timber," he whispered. He squeezed the trigger. The saw screamed, winding up to full power. He swung the bar hard against the pole, expecting the teeth to bite into the wood and send chips flying. Screech! A sound like a car crash pierced the air. Elias's arms jarred violently, the shockwave traveling all the way up to his shoulders. The chainsaw didn't cut, it bounced. Sparks, bright white-hot sparks sprayed out from the point of contact. "What the hell?" Elias yelled, stumbling back. He looked at the pole. There was barely a scratch on it, a faint white line like he tried to cut a diamond with a butter knife. He looked at his saw. The chain was ruined. Half the teeth were sheared off, jagged and broken. The metal guide bar was bent slightly to the left. Petrified? Elias wondered out loud, his contractor brain trying to make sense of it. Is it fossilized wood? Ironwood? He poked the pole with his boot. It felt solid, immovable, like it was rooted to the center of the earth. Suddenly, the chainsaw engine began to sputter. It coughed once, twice, and then stalled out completely. Silence slammed back into the valley. It was heavy silence, the kind that presses against your ears. No birds sang, no crickets chirped, even the wind seemed to have died.
Elias stood there, holding the useless, smoking chainsaw. He felt exposed. He was 30 rows away from the safety of the house, standing next to a thing that shouldn't be there. "Okay," breathed Elias. "Okay, need a different blade. Maybe a diamond tip, or just burn the damn thing." He bent down to inspect the chainsaw engine, setting it on the dirt. He turned his back to the scarecrow to yank the starter cord again, just to see if he could get it running for the walk back. He didn't like the idea of walking back in silence. He pulled the cord. Nothing. He pulled again. Nothing. "Piece of junk," he hissed, wiping sweat from his forehead. It was unnaturally hot out here. Then he heard it. Krr. Krr. It was a dry sound, like stiff fabric rubbing together, like dried corn husks being crushed. It came from right behind him. Elias froze. His hand hovered over the starter cord. The air on the back of his neck felt suddenly cold despite the noon sun. He stood up slowly. He gripped the chainsaw by the top handle, swinging it around like a club. "Who's there?" he shouted, spinning around. There was no one, just the empty field, the distant tree line, and the scarecrow. But something was wrong. Elias blinked. He took a step back, his boots crunching on the hard dirt. When he had started sawing, the scarecrow had been facing the woods. Its empty sleeves had been pointing toward the trees. Elias was sure of it. He vividly remembered the back of the tuxedo jacket being what he looked at while he aimed the saw. Now, the scarecrow was facing him. The blank burlap face was tilted slightly downward, aimed directly at Elias's eyes. The empty black holes of the sleeves hung at its sides, but the shoulders were squared up to him. It hadn't turned on a swivel. There was no swivel. The pole was solid. "No," Elias whispered. The word tasted like ash. He looked at the ground around the pole. The dirt was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign that someone had run out, spun it around, and ran away in the 3 seconds Elias had his back turned. It had moved. It had moved while he wasn't looking. The dark stains where the eyes should be seemed to pulse slightly in the heat haze. Elias felt a primal urge to run. It started in his stomach, a cold knot tightening, telling him that he was prey. But his pride, his stubborn city boy pride, nailed his feet to the floor. "The wind," he said, his voice cracking. "Just the wind. Loose fitting." He backed away. 1 step, 2 steps. He didn't take his eyes off the burlap face. "You stay there," he warned, raising the broken chainsaw like a shield. "You stay right there." He kept backing up until he hit the edge of the weeds. Then he turned and walked fast toward the house. He didn't run. Men like Elias Thorne didn't run from bundles of straw. But he walked very, very fast. When he reached the porch, he threw the chainsaw down. It clattered loudly against the wood. He fumbled for the keys to the sliding door, his fingers shaking so bad he dropped them twice. "Open, damn it." He got the door open, slid inside, and slammed it shut. He threw the lock. Then he grabbed a chair from the kitchen table and wedged it under the handle. He stood in the middle of the living room, chest heaving. It felt like he'd sprinted a mile. He looked out the window. The scarecrow was a small speck in the distance again, motionless, harmless. "I'm losing it," Elias said, rubbing his face with both hands. Isolation psychosis. Stress. Carbon monoxide?
I need to check the furnace. He paced around the room. He needed to get out. He couldn't stay here tonight. Not with the bridge out. Not with that. He checked his phone again. Still no service. Okay. Plan B, Elias said. The storm knocked out the bridge, but the creek is shallow. If I can just hike down there, I can wade across, walk to the main road, hitch a ride into town. He went to the window to look at the sky. 10 minutes ago, it had been a clear blue dome, high noon. Now, heavy, bruised clouds were boiling over the rim of the valley walls. They weren't moving like normal clouds. They were tumbling over each other, fast and aggressive, like smoke from a tire fire. They were swallowing the blue sky, turning the light in the valley a sickly greenish gray. Thunder rumbled. It didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like stones grinding together deep underground. You have got to be kidding me, Elias groaned. Rain started to hit the window. Not a drizzle, but immediate, violent sheets of water. It slammed against the glass like gravel. Elias ran to the front window. He looked toward the driveway and the blocked bridge. The creek, which had been a polite trickle yesterday, was rising, fast. Brown, churning water was already spilling over the banks, widening into a muddy river that cut off the entire front of the property. The valley was a bowl, and the bowl was filling.
Then, a voice spoke from the other side of the door. It wasn't the Widow Gable. It wasn't human. It sounded like dry leaves sliding over gravel. A voice that had no breath, no lungs, just friction. Open. Elias turned and ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, his flashlight beam swinging wildly in the dark. He didn't stop until he reached the master bedroom. He slammed the door, locked it, and shoved a dresser in front of it. He backed into the corner, sliding down until he hit the floor. He sat there in the dark, clutching the drill, listening to the house below him. He heard the front door handle rattle again. Then silence. Then, from the backyard, from the direction of the south field, came a new sound. Crack! The sound of wood splintering. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a fence post snapping, or a porch railing giving way, or 3 rows of distance closing in a single heartbeat.